She's my teacher, and she told me I shouldn't be tempted. But the truth is, I can see she already is. The first day I noticed her, really noticed her, was one of those ordinary mornings that somehow turns into something I can't forget. I had walked into the classroom, the hum of chatter and scraping chairs filling the air, and there she was, standing near the whiteboard, adjusting her scarf in that absent-minded way that somehow made her look both elegant and fragile at the same time. Her presence wasn't loud, it was quiet, measured, yet impossible to ignore. I remember the way the sunlight slanted through the tall windows, catching the subtle highlights in her hair, making it glow with a soft warmth. I tried to focus on my notes, but I found my eyes drifting, noticing the curve of her smile as she corrected a student's work, the way her fingers lingered on the edge of the desk, as if she weren't quite ready to let go. There was a rhythm to her gestures, a graceful steadiness that felt almost like a heartbeat I could sense from across the room. When it was my turn to hand in my assignment, our hands brushed, briefly, unintentionally. I felt a small spark, a warmth that traveled up my arm and settled in my chest. She glanced at me, just for a moment, her eyes holding mine a second longer than necessary, and then she looked away. That hesitation, subtle as it was, stuck with me. It wasn't flirtation in the obvious sense, there was no overt comment, no lingering words, but something in the way she moved, the faint catch in her breath, the way she adjusted the collar of her blouse, spoke to me in a language I didn't quite know how to read. I spent the rest of the class acutely aware of her presence, feeling the quiet tension of noticing someone so carefully, so fully, while knowing I had to act normal. I wasn't sure if she felt it too, if she was aware that her attention lingered on me in the same way mine did on her, but that small, shared moment left a mark. By the time class ended, I was both exhilarated and slightly guilty, like I'd trespassed into a space I wasn't meant to enter. Yet, the thought of her stayed with me, her soft laugh as she reminded a student to focus, the gentle tilt of her head, the subtle warmth of her proximity. For the first time, I realized this wasn't just a teacher I respected, it was someone who, in ways I couldn't yet name, had captured my attention entirely. The story was beginning, and I had no idea how much that single glance, that fleeting brush of hands, would change everything. The days that followed that first brush of hands were strange in a way I hadn't expected. It wasn't that anything overt happened between us, but the air seemed charged, a little heavier, as if the space around her held a secret just out of reach. I noticed the way she would pause at my desk, lingering slightly longer than necessary when returning a graded paper, the corners of her mouth twitching into the faintest smile as if she were amused by something only she understood. It was during one of those quiet moments, after class had ended and the hallway had emptied, that I began to notice more. She was crouched beside a student's desk, offering advice on a math problem, and I caught her glancing at me from the corner of her eye. Her gaze wasn't accusatory, nor was it purely professional, it carried a subtle curiosity, almost like she was weighing whether I noticed her, too. My heart jumped, though I tried to mask it by pretending to organize my notebooks. When she finally stood, she brushed a strand of hair behind her ear, her fingers grazing her neck, and the movement seemed deliberate in a way that made my stomach tighten. I realized I was studying her gestures as closely as she might have been studying mine, each glance, each pause, a silent conversation. There was something about the way she tilted her head slightly when she listened, how her voice softened when speaking privately, that drew me in. I wasn't sure if it was intentional or just the natural rhythm of her presence, but it captivated me. Later, she handed me back my assignment, her fingers brushing the tips of mine for just a moment. That fleeting contact sent a shiver up my arm. She looked at me, eyes flicking downward for a fraction of a second before meeting mine again, and I caught a brief flash of hesitation, a subtle awareness that mirrored my own. It was as though we were both trying to measure the distance, silently negotiating boundaries, neither fully crossing, yet neither entirely retreating. I left the classroom that day with a strange mixture of excitement and guilt, my mind replaying every nuance of our interactions. Her presence lingered even after I walked out into the bright afternoon sun, the faint scent of her perfume, the warmth of her proximity, the way her eyes had held mine just long enough to make me aware of something unspoken. It was then I realized that this attraction wasn't just my imagination. She was aware of it too, in her own quiet, careful way. And that realization made everything feel both thrilling and forbidden, a tension I couldn't ignore, a story that had only just begun to unfold. By the third week, the tension between us had shifted from subtle curiosity to something heavier, harder to ignore. It wasn't just that I noticed her anymore, it was that I could feel her noticing me, too, in moments too small to be obvious. A glance held just a heartbeat too long, a soft sigh escaping her lips as she concentrated on her work, the gentle brush of her hand against mine when passing papers. Each instant seemed innocent in isolation, but together they formed a pattern I couldn't deny. I began to recognize a strange mixture in her, the confidence of a teacher used to control, to authority, tempered by moments of hesitation, almost vulnerability, whenever our eyes met. One afternoon, she leaned over my desk to explain a concept, her hair brushing lightly against my arm. I could feel the warmth of her presence, a subtle pressure that lingered longer than it should. My chest tightened, and I had to remind myself to breathe. It was intoxicating, but also disorienting, this tension that neither of us named, yet both seemed to feel. Her voice had changed, too, though in ways I almost missed. It was softer, quieter, almost intimate, when she spoke to me one-on-one. "Careful with this step," she said, her hand hovering near mine as if to guide, though she stopped short. There was a pause, an unspoken acknowledgement in that silence, that made my heart thrum. I felt like I was teetering on a line neither of us wanted to cross, yet neither could retreat from. I caught her watching me once, just for a moment, when she thought I wasn't looking. The way her eyes softened, the subtle shift of her posture, leaning just slightly closer to the edge of my space, made it clear she was aware, and perhaps intrigued. I felt a pang of guilt, too. This wasn't supposed to happen. She was my teacher, and I was her student. Yet in that moment, it didn't matter. The pull between us was undeniable. After class, I lingered at my desk, pretending to gather my things while secretly hoping for a word, a glance, a sign. She walked past, pausing briefly, and our fingers brushed in the smallest, most fleeting touch imaginable. It was enough. Enough to send a shiver down my spine, enough to make me aware that this attraction was mutual. And yet, there was restraint, a quiet acknowledgement of boundaries neither of us wanted to violate. By the end of the day, I knew something fundamental had shifted. This was no longer a passing curiosity. It was awareness, desire, and hesitation all wrapped together, a tension that would shape everything to come, and a story that had just begun to deepen. It started innocently enough, a tutoring session after school, the kind of quiet, focused meeting she had suggested to help me with an assignment I was struggling with. The classroom was empty, sunlight streaming through the windows and casting long, golden beams across the floor. The world outside seemed distant, almost muted, as if this small space existed for only the two of us. She was patient, her voice calm and measured as she guided me through problems I didn't quite understand. But as I watched her explain, I noticed the small details that had begun to anchor themselves in my mind, the way she would tuck a loose strand of hair behind her ear, the gentle rhythm of her breathing, the quiet concentration in her eyes that made everything else fade away. When she glanced at me, there was an unspoken warmth there, a fleeting softness that made my chest ache with both longing and hesitation. At one point, she leaned over my desk to point out an error, and I could feel the warmth of her arm brushing against mine. It was subtle, almost accidental, but the sensation lingered far longer than the moment itself. I was acutely aware of the proximity, of the tiny space that separated us, and of the unspoken connection that seemed to grow stronger with every passing second. I caught myself hoping that our hands would brush again, though part of me scolded myself for even thinking it. Then she paused, her gaze shifting from my work to mine, and for a moment, the classroom seemed to shrink around us. "You're making progress," she said softly, her voice carrying a quiet pride. I felt a surge of something deeper than accomplishment, a sense of being seen, understood, appreciated. It wasn't just about schoolwork, it was about the quiet emotional bridge forming between us. After a long moment, she added a story about her own struggles when she was younger, something small and personal, shared almost hesitantly. Her vulnerability was unexpected, and it drew me in completely. I listened intently, sensing the weight behind her words, the care with which she shared a piece of herself. When she laughed softly at her own memory, it was like sunlight breaking through clouds, and I felt my own tension ease, replaced by a warmth that had nothing to do with schoolwork. By the time I left, I realized something had shifted. There was a new layer to our connection, one built not on attraction alone, but on understanding, trust, and a subtle intimacy that neither of us had named yet. That day, I learned that slow moments, quiet glances, and gentle touches could speak louder than words, and that the story unfolding between us was moving from curiosity towards something far more profound. The tension between us had grown almost unbearable by the time Friday rolled around. It wasn't something we could easily ignore anymore, the subtle glances, the accidental brushes of hands, the soft laughter that seemed to linger in the air longer than it should. Each interaction carried a weight now, a quiet electricity that made ordinary moments feel charged and alive. It happened during a late afternoon class, the sun low in the sky, casting long shadows across the desks. I was concentrating on my notes when I felt a sudden presence beside me. She was leaning over, pointing to something on the page, her hand brushing mine for the briefest moment. The contact, though fleeting, sent a shiver through me. I looked up to meet her gaze, and for a heartbeat, the world seemed to pause. There was a hesitation in her eyes, a flicker of awareness, and I realized with a sudden jolt that she felt it too. After class, the hallway was nearly empty. I lingered near my locker, pretending to gather my things, though I could feel her approach before she even spoke. "Are you staying after for help again?" she asked, her voice calm, yet there was an undertone I couldn't place, something softer, more personal. My heart thudded in my chest as I nodded, and we walked together to the empty classroom, the sound of our footsteps echoing in the quiet building. Inside, she moved to the desk near the window, adjusting a stack of papers. The sunlight caught her hair, giving it a warm glow, and I couldn't help but notice the way her sleeve brushed against her wrist, the subtle sway of her posture as she shifted. When she looked up at me, our eyes met and held, neither of us speaking. The air was thick with unspoken acknowledgement, a tension that was almost physical, pressing gently against my awareness. At one point, she leaned forward to retrieve a book from the top shelf. Our hands hovered over it simultaneously, fingers brushing almost imperceptibly. I felt a small shock, a spark of connection that made me acutely aware of every inch between us. Neither of us pulled away immediately, but the moment was fleeting, delicate, almost forbidden in its intimacy. It was the closest we had come to truly acknowledging the desire simmering beneath the surface, without a word, without a confession. By the time I left that day, I knew we were both acutely aware of the line we were walking. Every look, every touch, carried more weight now. The tension had peaked, not in grand gestures, but in the quiet, charged moments where proximity alone was enough to speak volumes. I realized that this slow-burn attraction wasn't just teasing or curiosity, it was real, mutual, and unavoidable, and we were both learning how to navigate it without stepping too far. The day she spoke those words, I felt the air itself shift. It wasn't dramatic, not in the way movies make confessions seem, there were no grand gestures, no shouting or sudden declarations. Instead, it was quiet, tentative, a careful unraveling of something that had been building for weeks. We were alone in the classroom again, sunlight spilling across the floor, the faint scent of her perfume mixing with the old paper and chalk dust in the air. I had stayed behind under the pretense of extra help, but both of us knew it had become something else, something that neither of us wanted to name, but that both of us could feel. She leaned against the edge of her desk, arms crossed loosely, her posture suggesting both authority and vulnerability at once. I shouldn't be tempted," she said softly, almost a whisper, her eyes flicking toward the floor. There was a pause, a hesitation that made my chest tighten. I wanted to reach out, to say something, anything, but I also knew this was delicate, a fragile thread stretched taut between us. I stepped a little closer, careful not to invade her space. "But, you already are," I replied quietly, my voice steady, even though my heart was racing. I could see her startle slightly, the way her gaze lifted slowly to meet mine, a mixture of surprise, hesitation, and something else I couldn't quite name yet. For a long moment, we just looked at each other, the silence stretching and folding around us. There was no rush, no pressure, just awareness. I could see the subtle changes in her posture, the way her shoulders relaxed fractionally, the faint exhale that seemed to release some invisible weight. It was a moment of recognition, mutual and profound. Then she moved slightly closer, just enough that our proximity became tangible. Her hand brushed against mine, not as a teacher, not as a student, but as two people acknowledging a connection that neither could fully articulate. The warmth of that touch, the gentle pressure, was enough to make the world outside the classroom fade. I felt her heartbeat, steady but quickened, a rhythm that seemed to echo my own. We spoke then, softly, honestly, sharing thoughts we had both been too cautious to voice. She admitted the pull she felt, I admitted mine, and we both realized that our connection wasn't fleeting curiosity, it was something deeper, something carefully restrained yet undeniable. In that quiet, charged space, we acknowledged the tension, the attraction, and the possibility of something unspoken yet profoundly mutual. By the time we parted, the air between us was lighter, warmer. There were no promises made, no overt declarations, but a shared understanding settled in. The slow burn that had been simmering for weeks was no longer a secret, and both of us were aware of its power and fragility. The last day of our after-school sessions arrived, and with it, a sense of calm inevitability. There was no dramatic confession this time, no need to articulate what had already been understood. The weeks of quiet glances, subtle touches, and shared moments of vulnerability had built something that neither of us could ignore, yet it wasn't reckless, it was deliberate, careful, and deeply human. The classroom was bathed in the soft glow of late afternoon sunlight, the kind that makes everything feel warm, golden, and suspended in time. She was straightening papers on her desk when I walked in, the subtle scent of her perfume filling the air, mingling with the familiar warmth of the room. I paused for a moment at the doorway, just taking her in, the gentle sway of her posture, the calm authority in her movements, and the quiet vulnerability that had drawn me in from the very beginning. "Are you ready?" she asked softly, looking up with that same mixture of strength and tenderness I had come to notice in every glance. I nodded, and we fell into our usual rhythm, working through the last of the problems together. But this time, there was a new layer to everything, a comfort, a trust, a sense of shared understanding that went beyond the tasks at hand. As I gathered my things to leave, our hands brushed once more. This time, I didn't pull away. Her fingers lingered, warm and steady against mine, and in that simple touch, I felt the culmination of weeks of unspoken acknowledgement. She smiled softly, a quiet, knowing smile, and I returned it, feeling the same mix of exhilaration and serenity. It wasn't lust or reckless desire, it was connection, awareness, and mutual respect, wrapped in the delicate intimacy we had carefully nurtured. Before I stepped toward the door, she tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, her eyes meeting mine. The unspoken message was clear, what we shared didn't need labels or public acknowledgement, it was real, meaningful, and ours alone. I felt a warmth spread through my chest, the kind of quiet happiness that lingers long after a moment has passed. Outside, the late afternoon sun painted the world in gold and amber. As I walked down the hallway, I glanced back once, and she was there, standing by her desk, her posture relaxed, her gaze gentle. No words were necessary. We had reached a point where the attraction, the connection, and the emotional intimacy we had built were fully understood, yet beautifully restrained. That day, I realized that slow-burn romance didn't always need dramatic gestures. Sometimes, it thrived in lingering touches, shared smiles, and moments of quiet understanding. We had crossed the threshold of unspoken desire into emotional closeness, and it felt like the most natural, right thing in the world. The story didn't need an ending, it was a beginning of something quietly profound, an age-gap connection grounded in respect, tenderness, and the promise of a future shaped by care, awareness, and subtle intimacy. If this slow-burn story touched your heart, don't forget to like and subscribe for more tales of quiet romance and forbidden attraction. Comment below, Which moment between them made your heart race the most? And hit the bell so you never miss a story where emotions speak louder than words.